Any health-related information on the following show provides general information only. Content presented on any show by any host or guest should not be substituted for a doctor's advice. Always consult your physician before beginning any new diet, exercise, or treatment program.
Welcome to Accelerated Health TV and Radio Show. I'm your host, Sara Banta. I'm a health coach, natural supplement expert, and a busy mom of three. Make sure you hit the subscribe button below so you're notified every week with my new podcast on Mondays and Tuesdays and a bonus one on Thursdays. And if you haven't already, join my free group coaching on Telegram with the link below. There is no downside. You can ask me questions 7 days a week, and I teach you on a daily basis with tips and tools to enhance your health. You will be a part of an amazing like-minded group to support you on your journey in addition to truly taking control of your health. My goal, I cannot do it alone, is to reach everyone on earth with eyes to see and ears to hear my message of healing. So help me with that goal. Share this podcast with a few of your friends who may need my help. We are talking about maximizing cellular health, and that means all things, right? And we've got an amazing guest, Jay Feldman. I'm super excited. He is a health coach, independent health researcher, host of the Energy Balance podcast. He uses bioenergetic approach to help men and women around the world maximize their cellular energy, optimize their health, and achieve freedom from low energy symptoms like chronic hunger, cravings, fatigue, brain fog, poor sleep, gut issues, hormonal imbalances, and stubborn weight gain. Did I hit anything that applies to you? Welcome, Jay. How are you today?
I'm good. Thanks so much for having me, Sarah.
I'm super excited because you are causing a little bit of a stir out there with the typical low carb, ketogenic world, and everyone is suffering. We are in a new world. The last 4 years has completely rocked us and turned things on its head. And I love the fact that you've got even people like Dr. Mercola thinking twice about what the right foods are to eat for energy. So what we're really talking about is metabolic dysfunction. And what people aren't realizing is it's not about protein, carbs, fat. It's about the right proteins, carbs, and fat, and the processed foods, the toxicity that we're dealing with that is disrupting our metabolic processes. And whenever there's a threat or your body sees it as a threat and switches into survival mode, then that changes things. And yesterday in my podcast about histamines, I talk about 5 disruptors which are causing, they could be low calorie, low carb, oxalates, sulfur foods, amyloid proteins from conventionally raised chicken and beef, or the wrong types of fats, which you talk about. All of those things could be healthy foods, but poison or disrupting our detox pathways. And that's causing insulin resistance at the cellular level, and that's not sugar. So it's not all about a ketogenic low carb diet. And the processed foods came in, changed that the whole food system in 1980s, and the typical American is eating 70% processed foods. So whether you're eating a ketogenic low carb protein bar or a vegan margarita or Mai Tai, it doesn't mean that it's healthy. And this is where I'm super excited, where we are aligned. I was on the ketogenic diet when keto became a big thing. I started taking exogenous ketones. I had had a brain injury, was in a car accident, and it was giving my brain that fuel. But what I did was I still stuck to a low fat diet because high fat doesn't work with my body. And I prioritized protein, filled in with vegetables and whole foods. I stuck to whole foods and it worked. But what's interesting, and I'm saying all of this because there's so much we're going to unpack today, is that it got really easy for me to just end up eating one meal a day because I was intermittent fasting. and I could feel my metabolic rate lower. Now, the body's smart, right? It's going to survive. And just recently, over the last month, was suffering from nausea, and I had lost a little weight, lost the muscle mass, and now that's all gone because I did a liver flush and it took care of it. But now I'm trying to ramp up the calories, increasing the carbs, increasing protein, but increasing everything, staying on all whole food. Um, and I'm probably eating an additional 1,000 calories a day on top of my regular. And my metabolic rate is shooting through the roof because my body's smart, right? It's getting what it's got. And it's not a low carb. I'm on a high carb diet at the moment, guys. I'm not on a low carb diet. So this is why I'm super excited to get into this and the true cause of cellular health decline and how to reverse that. So many people are over exercising, limiting their carb intake, and just thinking that if it's high protein, high fat, it's okay to eat, and they don't know why they are suffering. So lots to unpack here, Jay. I don't even know where to start.
Yeah, well, as you've kind of come to here or mentioned, we've kind of put the blame in the wrong place, right? We knew that there were various health issues, and processed foods is definitely a big part of it. We knew that there's been a lot of changes in recent decades to the food industry and what's been available, and that's led to declining health. And the question is, what has it been? And for a while, we blamed fat, right? That was the culprit, and everyone was on low fat diets, and we started to shift to the other primary macronutrient that isn't protein. Of course, protein can do no harm. So we switched over to carbohydrates and specifically sugar. And kind of like we did with the whole low fat fad, we went a bit too far. We missed the forest through the trees, so to speak. And of course, there can be problems with different carbohydrate containing foods out there, but it doesn't actually mean that the carbohydrates were to blame. And so I think that's really where we're coming to now.
Right. And that's where it's so interesting because I think the brain wants to just categorize something, say carbs are bad, because that's easier, right? It's easier for you to process versus this carb is good, this carb is bad. Processed food is bad, guys. Preservatives are bad. GMOs, glyphosate, all of that is disrupting the detox pathways and cellular function. But what is why is the lack of cellular energy the root cause of disease and aging? And disease and aging have become accelerated over the last 3 to 4 years, even more so than ever.
Yeah, absolutely. So, what we're talking about here is the energy that's produced inside every single cell, inside the mitochondria. We call that ATP. And that's what allows for every process in our body to occur. Literally anything that our body wants to do. You mentioned detoxification. We can talk digestion. We can talk brain function and just having a thought. We can talk movement and exercise. All of those things require energy. And as you said, our bodies are incredibly smart in this way, and they, unlike some sort of simple machine, they adapt to the environment that they're in. And if they're in an environment with a lot of energy, they know that they can function really well. They can function at optimal capacity. They can detoxify well. They can think well. They can have a really well functioning immune system. But when there's limited energy available, it's something that our bodies recognize. There's all sorts of signals, including hormones, that are involved there. And it turns down all of the processes that use energy, all of our metabolic processes. And short term, we might not notice too much, but long term, this can be really disruptive, and this can lead to the degeneration that we see, right? This leads to not only feeling bad, not being able to sleep, not having energy, dealing with fatigue, digestive issues, all of those things, but also actual degeneration because our tissues are in constant flux, right? There's always some degradation and repairing going on and regeneration. All of that requires energy. And so if we don't have the energy available, that ATP, we can't effectively regenerate and heal and recover. And instead we degrade and we start to see those sorts of issues crop up over time. And so that's where we want to put our focus, is in terms of how well or not well we're producing energy and what we can do when it comes to nutrition, when it comes to other lifestyle practices, when it comes to supplements, all of the different parameters, what can we do to maximize our capacity for energy production so that we have enough ATP to function optimally? That's really how we're going to optimize our health.
Okay, so the big question is, what are the things that degrade ATP production versus enhance ATP production?
Yeah, and that's the big question, and everything that we look at in our environment can plug in here. So everything around us is going to have an effect, whether we're talking about the macronutrients we're eating or our cognitive stimulation, if we're having an enjoyable conversation, how well we sleep. You mentioned pesticides and other chemicals; those things, of course, have play a role here. So it's something that is really a lens through which we can view any of those different parameters. That being said, there are certain things that are going to be the worst for energy production, the most disruptive. And you mentioned processed food, you mentioned, different types of fats, different types of carbs. So, for example, certain types of fats end up being disastrous for our energy production. These are called the polyunsaturated fats, or PUFA. Listeners might have heard of concerns around seed oils, and that's largely where that's coming from, is because they have these polyunsaturated fats, which cause major problems when it comes to our ability to produce energy. So I'm sure we'll dig into that. Along with it, low calories is a prerequisite, right? We can't produce enough energy if we don't have enough fuel. So if we wanted to immediately reduce our capacity for energy production, not eating enough, encouraging fasting, intermittent fasting, those kinds of things, is really a good way to decrease the energy our bodies have available for function. So getting enough fuel on board and making sure it's the right types of fuels, as you said as well, making sure we have enough carbohydrates. It is essential for optimal energy production. I'm sure we'll dig into that as well. And then there's a number of other aspects of our environment that can really interfere with our mitochondria's ability to produce energy. So it'll be certain types of fats. There's another big one, which is called endotoxin. Another name for this is lipopolysaccharide, or LPS. This is a component of bacteria that we have in our microbiome, mostly in our intestines. And this one is incredibly problematic and directly disrupts our ability for energy production, so much so that if we have the extreme version of endotoxemia, high levels of endotoxin, we end up in a state of sepsis, which is a leading cause of death from infection when we're immunocompromised. Of course, it's a very extreme example, but we can be dealing with lower levels of endotoxin all the time. And this is implicated in insulin resistance and diabetes, fatty liver disease, atherosclerosis. So all of the processes that we're seeing crop up in massive quantities, massive frequencies in our population come back to endotoxin as a major driver there. So that's another big one. And, we can talk nutrient deficiencies, we can talk heavy metals. All of these things are going to pretty directly either support or impair our ability for energy production in our cells to produce ATP.
I love that you're talking about this because I focused on unexplained weight gain a couple weeks ago, and how many times do you hear, I'm doing all the things right, I'm exercising, I'm eating low carb, I'm doing this and this, and the weight is just coming back on. Well, radiation causes insulin resistance, the toxins and LPS, just like you're talking about. If your gut is not fixed, then just throw everything out the window, right? I mean, you have to do the basics, and it's not about the calories. So I want to talk about this true pandemic of insulin resistance. And I have had multiple people just this week say, Sara, this is what I'm eating. My insulin resistance will not come down. What do you do about it? What is causing this inflammation and insulin resistance? It's not sugar. And by the way, sugar, I used to be a Splenda fiend. I would eat tons of it. And then I was eating stevia. Both of those things just totally destroyed the inside of me. My body loves just regular sugar, fruit, and the real carbs, the real food, the way nature intended it. But let's talk about the inflammation and insulin resistance and why sugar is not the cause, but these other things are.
Yeah, and what a concept, right? That the foods that are available to us and are made directly for animals, like fruits, can actually be supportive of our health. But in any case, we have largely done the same thing with insulin resistance and diabetes that we did with cardiovascular disease, right? We looked at cholesterol levels, we looked at plaque, we said those two things go together. High cholesterol must be the driver of cardiovascular disease. We all need to stop eating fat. We have to stop eating saturated fat. We have to avoid cholesterol containing foods. And we know now that that was a mistake, right? But we've done the same thing when it comes to insulin resistance. We see there's this cellular insulin response issue. There's high levels of glucose in the blood. So these high levels of glucose must be causative. And so we must avoid anything that increases glucose levels. And what we're doing here is treating the symptom, right? We're blaming the firemen for the fire when they aren't actually to blame. They aren't actually causing that situation. They're there because of the issue, because of the underlying problem. So that's, I think, the larger framework we want to consider, or just kind of as a tiptoe in here. But what I would say is actually the driver, what actually is causing the elevated blood sugar and causing the inhibition or the problems with the cellular response to insulin has everything to do with our ability to produce energy. So when our cells have carbohydrates, they have glucose available, but they can't convert them to ATP, the cell A is in a distress state, but B, it actually has all of the glucose and its metabolites build up because you have all this fuel there and the engine can't convert it into energy and actually do what it needs to do. So the gas tank is essentially overflowing. Insulin is coming around with some more glucose and saying, hey, let's put some more glucose into the cell, but the gas tank is already full. The cell is already full of glucose. And so the real problem here is that our cells are having metabolic problems, right? They're not actually able to convert that fuel coming in into energy. And so then we're seeing this buildup of the fuel. And so where we want to put our focus is not on avoiding the fuel. We need that fuel in order to function, in order to produce the ATP in an efficient way. But we want to fix all of the number of things that are going to be involved with actually producing energy from the glucose.
So essentially, there's plenty of gas in the gas tank, but the gas is not being converted into actually making the car run.
Exactly.
Correct? Yeah. Okay. So there's a problem in the function of it. It's not a factor of too much sugar. It's just that it's not being converted. So where does the disruptors, okay, so the cells are stressed. And I know you talk about the body being in survival mode. When the body's in survival mode, it will lower its metabolic rate. It will convert T4 into reverse T3. It's going to build this layer of amazing visceral fat to protect our organs. And all of these things are happening. And your body's going to store fat because we don't know if we're going to be chased by a tiger or have a famine coming up. So how is that triggering insulin resistance?
So if we just look at the hormonal side, and that's a lot of what you were discussing, right? T4 conversion to reverse T3, elevated levels of cortisol, those things have direct effects at the cells, right? The cells are responding to the hormonal state because the hormones are the signals that the body uses to communicate that we're in a low metabolic state. We aren't in a good, comfortable, abundant environment. And so those hormones will directly interfere with mitochondrial function and basically prevent us from converting that glucose to energy for the exact reason that you mentioned. When we're in that state, we want to be storing fuel. Our bodies are in a storage mode because they're viewing this as scarcity. So they want to be storing the fuel as body fat instead of converting it to energy. And our hormones do this. We know that cortisol does this. For example, we can look at the extreme states of high cortisol, like Cushing syndrome, where somebody's storing lots of body fat just due to these elevated levels of cortisol. And we see the same thing in severe states or even just moderate states of hypothyroidism that you were kind of alluding to. If we don't have enough of the active thyroid hormone T3 and we have a lot of reverse T3, the same process is happening. We're blocking or providing a signal, basically telling the engine not to run so we can go and store that fuel as body fat. And so we have both things going on. On one hand, we have this excess fuel. We see the glucose rise. We see the cells not responding to insulin. We see this state where we're storing body fat. And then at the same time, we have less energy available. So we're not actually functioning and feeling good like we can.
Okay. So the other thing I wanted to focus on, you mentioned the PUFAs and the seed oils. Can you explain how it's not sugar, it's not carbs, these are fats, and we're supposed to be on a high fat ketogenic diet? These wrong fats or bad fats could actually be triggering insulin resistance.
Yeah, absolutely. And they fit right in here. So the polyunsaturated fats, these are, as you said, the seed oils. So this is canola and soy and cottonseed oil, the ones in most of the processed foods or fried foods. They're also going to be found in high amounts in seeds and nuts. That's where they come from. There's a couple of exceptions, but most seeds and nuts are very high in the polyunsaturated fats. And then another kind of hidden source, and you were kind of alluding to this, especially in the low carb, carnivore, keto sphere, chicken and pork are not often considered to be concerning in this way, but they're often very, very high in the polyunsaturated fats because their fat is reflected or will reflect whatever they eat. So they're often being fed a lot of the grains and oils. And so then they have very high amounts of the polyunsaturated fats in their fat as well. So those are some of the main sources of polyunsaturated fats, especially the omega 6s. And when we consume them, there's a couple of things that happen. So for one, these are the least stable fats by far. So when we're comparing the least stable polyunsaturated fats, or some of the least stable, to even monounsaturated, which are a lot more stable, we're talking hundreds of times less stability and more susceptibility to damage. We essentially just have these weak, fragile fats. If you think of putting oil on a pan that's too hot and it starts to smoke, that same kind of thing is essentially happening internally when we're using those, not even as a fuel, but even just going through digestion, which is a pretty intensive process, and being exposed to our body temperature of 98 degrees, and then also going through all of these oxidative processes in the mitochondria. There's a lot of places where these fats can get damaged. And so that's the first concern. But even worse than that is we are structurally made up of a lot of protein, but also a lot of fat. Every cell has fat in its outer membrane and like the encapsulation of the cell, but also in a lot of the different organelles inside, including the mitochondria. So we're taking these very unstable fats and then incorporating them into the structure of every single cell of our body. And that not only leaves our actual structure susceptible to damage, but it also essentially introduces instability in the structure. If we're thinking the wall of a house, something that we don't want to be introducing a weak building material there. And so another way we can think of this, and we'll kind of, I guess, jump around with analogies, but if we think of a hydroelectric dam, that's very similar to how our cells produce energy. We put a lot of hydrogen ions or protons on one side. You can think of that like the water. And then we want to kind of spin it through this one little area. It pushes a wheel around and that makes ATP. That's kind of the general idea. When these fats, these very unstable fats, are used in that dam, it's basically introducing holes into the wall that the water is able to leak through. And so we're running out of all this pressure. We're leaking out all of this potential energy that we could be using to produce ATP. So we can take all of the kind of physiological processes and mechanisms there, but the way that actually looks in real life is we eat these fats and we then can't convert the food that's coming in into energy, and we store it as body fat. So this can't be understated how much of an effect these have. And to leave kind of that category or that subject with one last statement to kind of provide how important these are. When we look between species of all animals that we see on the planet, every animal we can think of, there's different amounts of these fats inside of the structure of the cells. And the number one thing associated with how quickly animals age and how long they live, how long their lifespan is the amount of these polyunsaturated fats. So the more unsaturated our cells are, the shorter we live and the faster we age. And then the opposite, right? The fewer of these unsaturated fats we have inside every cell, the slower we age and longer we live. And we see this across every single species on the planet.
Wow. And all of these fats, whether you are going to a nice restaurant and getting that balsamic vinegar and olive oil dressing, a lot of times that olive oil is cut with canola oil and you don't know it. You go to Whole Foods and you look up the organic butternut squash soup, and it's got organic canola oil in it. And so it's really, unfortunately, hard now because our food supply has been hijacked, but you have to be vigilant. And sugar is not the enemy. Sugar is in and out of your body within a day. These fats are in your cells for what, over a year, I've heard. I mean, the damage they do is so much worse and is comparable to smoking.
Yeah, it's crazy, and I think it's such a great example. Everywhere you look now, any restaurant, this is the oil that's being used. Any food on the shelf, unfortunately, even Whole Foods at their hot bar, whatever they're cooking in these oils,
Yeah.
and that's because they're cheap and inexpensive, and they got slapped with the heart healthy sticker. You can see it on all the bottles of canola oil at the store. But if we think back 100 years to what our grandparents and great grandparents before that were cooking with, it was animal fats. It was butter. It was lard from pork that was also eating saturated fats anyway, so it was still very highly saturated. And yeah, we've moved quite a ways away from that. And as you said, olive oil is pretty good here as well, but we can't even trust most of the olive oils on the shelf anymore.
So what are the healthy fats? What should we be cooking with and using in our recipes?
Yeah, so we do have a number of options. Butter and ghee are great options. Beef tallow and coconut oil work as well. Those are most of our more saturated fats. And then we can also use some of the monounsaturated fats like olive oil and avocado oil and macadamia nut oil, but they aren't quite as heat stable. So if we're going to be cooking with the fat, I would typically prefer coconut oil, butter, ghee, or beef tallow or lamb tallow, any sort of tallow like that.
So when I'm eating my bison ribeye steak, am I wanting to eat that gristle? Is that the saturated fat? How does that work in the body and into this equation?
Yeah, and those are the right types of fats we want to be eating, and the amount we might need is going to vary from person to person, but those are the fats that we want to be using for structure inside our cells. Those are the stable fats that help to keep the protons on one side so we don't have a leaky battery, we don't have a leaky hydroelectric dam, we can produce energy really efficiently. They aren't susceptible to damage, which we see everywhere. If we look at plaque in the arteries, we see damaged unsaturated fats in there, damaged polyunsaturated fats in there. We see them pretty much in any disease process you can think of. If we're looking at the brain in Alzheimer's, in Parkinson's, in any sort of disease process, we see damaged polyunsaturated fats. So we really want to favor the very stable saturated and monounsaturated fats. Both of those are great. And so you've mentioned, meat as, beef, bison, lamb. Those are great sources as well. We talked a little bit about dairy having good fats. We have to be a little more careful with chicken and pork because those fats depend on what those animals are eating. But if they're eating a really good pastured diet, then those fats are fine as well. And, we mentioned avocados, olives, and those being ones that are mostly monounsaturated as well. So those are the types of fats that we want to favor as opposed to the nuts, seeds, and the oils especially, which are going to be by far and away the largest source of PUFA in our diet.
Okay, so we're not demonizing carbs, and we're deciding what, or talking about the right fats versus the wrong fats. Where does protein fit into the equation? And I do love that you talk about everybody's different, because my view is me compared to me 3 years ago needs a different profile of foods. And whatever my current state of health is, my immune system, my hormones, my weight loss, weight gain, goals, exercise, stress, all of those things matter. And you have to take them into an equation. It's not just a quick, look at your phone on an app and decide what your macros are. But where does protein fit into the equation?
So protein is our primary building block for most of our tissues. We're talking muscle and bone and skin. Everything is made up of protein. And so we need to have enough of those building blocks on board. That being said, we don't really use protein very efficiently as a fuel source. Normally, we actually just convert it to glucose if we do need to use it for fuel. Sometimes we'll use the amino acids themselves, but that's less frequently happening. But so because of that, we have a very particular need for protein. And beyond that, any extra building blocks doesn't actually help us too much. So it's one where we do have that Goldilocks zone depending on the individual. And what they tend to find in the research, and this is research looking at people with really the highest protein needs. We're talking about people who are really trying to build a lot of muscle with resistance training. We're talking athletes. And what they find in that sort of population is that 0.63 grams of protein per pound of body weight is where we get the maximum benefit. And beyond that, we're not actually getting any more benefit to muscle mass and actually building tissue. I normally like to provide a little buffer there. So I'll normally suggest that we get between 0.6 and 0.8 grams of protein per pound of body weight as enough to cover our needs. But beyond that, if we're talking about wanting to actually improve our structure, improve whether we're talking muscle mass or our brain or liver or any sort of other organ we want to repair, beyond that, right, 0.6 to zero point 0.8 grams of protein per pound, we actually don't get any more benefit. And we can start to have some negatives. And that's, I would say the biggest one is we're just displacing our fuel. Protein can be very filling. And so if we're having a lot of protein, it's normally going to come at the cost of getting enough carbs and fats. And those are the ones that we actually need to produce energy that we need to build the structure. We need the energy there to construct. And so that's normally the range I would suggest that basically maximizes the benefit and doesn't come at the cost of the other macronutrients.
So here I am. I live in Southern California. Every single woman in this town is working out once to twice a week. They're not eating. They're picking at a chicken salad at lunch, and they're probably having a couple glasses of wine at night, but they're not eating a lot of food. And that's if they're not on Ozempic. So with that being said, you're taking someone and they can't lose weight. Okay. So you're taking someone on their basis is very low calorie, maybe eating 800 to 1,000 calories a day. They're, like I said, they're completely overworking out and they're perimenopausal, menopausal. So their adrenals are probably totally burnt out as well. How do you take that person and get them to build their metabolism, increase it, and get them to optimize their cellular health?
It's a great question. And that's one of the toughest populations, right? Because that's a population that has decreased their metabolism over time. Just like you said, intentionally trying to lose weight and doing all the right things, being really, really committed, working really, really hard at the gym and making sure not to overeat in terms of calories. And in the process, their bodies have gone into a low battery mode where they're kind of just barely getting by, barely functioning, and they're not losing the body fat that they're working so hard to lose. So it's a really tough situation. And in terms of working out of it, the first thing I would say is slow and steady. It's, we don't want to all of a sudden double the amount of calories we're eating. In most cases, that doesn't go particularly well. Although I know you said you increased your calories by about 1,000 calories a day and are doing great on it. So,
however, I did it slowly because even in my female brain, I'm like, I don't trust this. And I also have to say that it was not inflammatory processed foods. I wasn't eating Ben and Jerry's and potato chips. It's more of the whole foods, the squashes and the potatoes and the rice, that type of, and seeing what works for me. And not all of those carbs work for everybody. And you've got to listen to your body. If the scale goes up more than 2 pounds in a day, that's inflammation. That's your body telling you, yeah, I didn't like that food. That's not 2 pounds of fat or muscle. There's no way. So just a little trick. The bathroom scale isn't good for telling you what your body composition is. I believe it's there to tell you about what you shouldn't have eaten the day before, right? The inflammatory response to the food that you've eaten.
Yeah, that's a great point. When we're looking at, whatever we've eaten one day to the next, and we're seeing a big change in the scale, as you said, that's not body fat. It's inflammation, it's swelling, it's water weight, which we want to pay attention to, right? It can be a really clear indicator, but also it's helpful to know that that doesn't mean that what you ate actually caused you to gain that much body fat. But yeah, if we take somebody in that scenario, the first thing I would say, normally that's someone who's on a high protein, high vegetable diet, high raw vegetable diet. I would say let's start to reduce these really hard to digest filling raw vegetables and replace them with easier to digest nutrition sources that are going to help raise our metabolism and bring down our stress hormones, which is the important signal for getting that engine going. The first one I would start with is those easy to digest carbohydrates. I think fruit is a really great starting place for most people. And so that's where I would start. You mentioned some different starch sources like squashes, potatoes, sweet potatoes, rice. I think those can be great as well. Normally, I would start with the fruit, and that can just be a piece of fruit with each meal to start with. And for anyone who's coming from low carb, this can sound like a lot, but I think you'll be really surprised by how much fruit you actually have to eat a good amount of carbs. I think our view gets skewed. We think we're eating a few blueberries and an apple, and we're at 70 grams of carbs. And in reality, it's quite a bit less. So that's where I would start. And what we want to see is our appetite starting to come up. We don't want to suppress our appetite. I know you mentioned Ozempic, but when our appetite is going up, it's a sign that we're shifting out of that low battery mode state, that our mitochondria, our engines are working, and they're asking for more fuel. So it's normally a good sign. And I would slowly increase from the carbohydrates and the fats as well. If someone's coming from very low fat like that, we need that fat for building blocks, for hormones, for digestion. We don't necessarily need a massive amount like keto diet levels, but we do need some. And so, we would want to start to favor those fats from the sources we discussed earlier. And that would be my start. And it can be, I'd recommend that it's slow and steady, as you described. See how you feel, see how it affects your energy, your mood, how you feel throughout the day. If you're noticing changes in your sleep, that's a really big one when somebody's low carb, is sleep will tend to go as well. And that's where I would start. And then I would just slowly increase and recognize as well, for an average person, kind of average body weight, our minimum carb needs are as high as about 220 grams per day. And when we're on low carb, that sounds astronomical. And if we're on an 800 calorie diet, that sounds astronomical. So we don't want to jump there, but we do want to continue to slowly increase. And the one piece of fruit with each meal is a great start, but it's not going to be the end goal.
So this is really interesting. I never ate fruit for all of my keto years, and then I started just having a bite of papaya, and I thought, "Hey, that's really good," and it's a low calorie fruit, and I then am able to eat a full papaya and all at one sitting. But what happened was I got off of the artificial sweeteners, the Splenda years ago, but the stevia even. And if you just take out the artificial sweeteners for 2 to 3 weeks, you will be amazed of the taste of true fruit sugar and honey. And you don't need a lot, and it's nature's dessert. And my body assimilated the nutrients and took it in. Never inflamed my body, never felt bloated, never had any side effects from the fruit, which was amazing. And I eat a ton of fruit now. I love cherries and apples, watermelon, and I try to pick fruits that are helping with nutrients that I need for what my daily stressors and that sort of thing. So that was one thing that was an aha moment. It's like, oh my goodness, I can eat fruit again, because it was so demonized during those years of keto. So that is, I love that you talk about fruit. The problems with intermittent fasting. Now, I do intermittent fast. Until lunchtime, I recommend using my accelerated keto supplement that helps with breaking down fatty liver, visceral fat, has some ketones in it, calms the brain down, gives you great energy, increases ATP by 5 to 10 times. And my feeling with that is that it is taking away the stress on the body, kicking you into ketosis, but then you support it. You're not just doing one meal a day. You're not fasting for 2 to 3 days at a time. You're just extending your fasting window and then squeezing in that eating window. But I know a lot of people who are trying to intermittent fast without a tool like that, and they are hangry, they've got a headache, they have no energy, their body doesn't know how to tap into that fuel, it's not metabolically flexible. and that's just one of these hormetic stressors. There's cold plunge, there's Wim Hof breathing, there's, and just a low carb diet. Why are these not good for you?
Yeah, so the idea behind these sorts of interventions is we're trying to create some amount of stress for our bodies to respond to. So the idea here is, like the dose makes the poison. Uh, you know, that we get stronger and we improve our resilience when we're exposed to a little bit of resistance, so to speak. No gain, no pain, no gain sort of mindset. And what we've done here, kind of like what we discussed earlier with insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes in terms of glucose, is we've kind of conflated these two different things. And so we can take something like calorie restriction, which is, if you look in the research, the one thing that every researcher agrees is the one thing that helps the most with health and increases lifespan and all of that. And so we've taken something like that, let's say, and we've said, well, we know that this is stressful. It activates all of our low energy sensors in the cells. We see those things, going off pretty strongly because the animals aren't getting enough food. And those things trigger all these other pathways. And that must be why calorie restriction is beneficial. And we've done the same thing with something like exercise or in this case, fasting, right? We've said fasting, we're avoiding food for a period of time, we're depriving the body of energy, so, and it equals certain benefits, people have beneficial results, so it must be because we've deprived the body of energy. But what I would actually say is that we have conflated those two things, and in each of those cases there are other aspects of something like fasting or calorie restriction that are responsible for the benefits rather than the stress that's being caused. So in the case of fasting, this is a situation where most people are inundated with this endotoxin that we talked about before. Every time they're eating, they're feeding these bacteria, their microbiome's imbalanced, they're producing a lot of endotoxin.
Mhm.
And what happens when we don't eat is we stop feeding these bacteria and they stop producing this endotoxin, and we're not getting hit with this intestinal permeability. So we're not having this big influx of this extremely damaging and toxic substance. And that's great. I mean, if we can avoid that, we're going to have a lot of benefits. And I think that is huge when it comes to why so many people feel better from fasting and from calorie restriction as well. I think another way to think of that is if we're eating less of the bad foods, and if we're looking at the research, the mice and rats are not eating healthy diets. They're eating canola oil and flour and sugar and vitamins and casein protein, and that's it's a fully processed, so to speak, just ingredient based diet, and they get fed less of this and they have certain benefits. And it's like, well, maybe if we had been feeding them something better, they actually wouldn't need the calorie restriction. And we see that there's this pair of studies at looking at primates, which of course are much more similar to us. They had one study where they calorie restricted them and they were doing way better, they were living longer, and this other study where they calorie restricted them and they had noticed no benefit. And when they looked at the diets, the ones that had the benefit were the ones that were eating a fully processed diet, whereas the other ones were eating their natural diet of mostly fruit and some vegetation. And that tells us everything we need to know here, which is that it's not anything to do with the stress caused by calorie restriction or the stress caused by fasting, but rather we're providing benefits through other means. And if we're dealing with an endotoxin problem and we get relief from that through something like fasting, that can go a long way to resolving autoimmune issues, to helping with weight loss, to helping with energy. It can make a really big difference. My preference is to try to accomplish that same thing without the stress, because
Mhm.
I would say that the stress over time is that signal that tells our bodies to go to low battery mode. So my preference would be, instead of calorie restricting, is to change up the diet. So we're eating the healthy primate diet, right? The whole food based diet as opposed to the processed one. Or in the case of fasting, if we're eating the really easy to digest and we fixed up our microbiome, so our gut is healthy and we're fueling ourselves properly, we shouldn't need to provide any relief from something like endotoxin by fasting. So that's kind of the way that I view this idea of hormesis and also things like fasting and calorie restriction.
Well, to add to that, in my experiment of myself, I am waking up, I'm working out, and I'm having a protein shake immediately after. So there's no fasting, or essentially it's just my overnight fasting.
Mm.
And my metabolism, like I said, it's just responding. I am 100% behind you with the endotoxins in the gut. And that's where I have a leaky gut bundle that seals that gut through supplements. So that is giving you that healed gut to negate the need for intermittent fasting for that purpose. Jay, I can't believe we are almost out of time. This is crazy. You are just a wealth of knowledge, and I love talking to you. Can you tell everyone about your food guide? Because everyone's sitting here going, okay, you told me what not to eat, and you kind of told me what to eat, but I really don't know. And that's where this food guide comes in. Will you tell everyone where? We're going to put the link in the show notes for sure. Tell people about it.
Yeah, so we talked about a lot of principles here. We talked about things to avoid. We talked about problems with endotoxin. But as you were saying, if someone's coming from fasting or low calorie or low carb, that doesn't mean we now know what to do, which foods are not going to cause the problems, which ones are going to support us if we have insulin resistance or any other health issue. So that's why I created this food guide. It's called the Energy Balance Food Guide. And it helps you determine exactly what to eat to optimally support your metabolism and help you lose weight, improve your digestion, get amazing sleep, boost your energy. And it's a one-page infographic. It organizes all the foods based on a spectrum that's based on how effectively they will support your metabolism and increase your ability to produce energy. And it has a separate spectrum in the case that you're dealing with any of the gut issues we talked about and you're still working on resolving them. And so that way we can be a little bit more careful with some of the foods that might be a bit harder to digest. So for listeners who'd like to take advantage and sign up for that free food guide, they can head to jfeldmanwellness.com/guide.
Perfect. And we'll have that in the show notes. And remember, it's the current state of health. You might be able to handle some of these foods in a month from now that you can't handle today. And that's the way I look at it. And what we're talking about today is cellular health. And the goal is to optimize ATP and mitochondrial health. And Jay, it's not going to be about the carnivore diet or the keto diet. It's going to be all about the mitochondrial diet. And everyone is different. Everyone has a different state of health, genetics, epigenetics, and all of these factors have been thrown at us over the last couple of years, making it a little more challenging. But people like you are helping everyone navigate through that. So thank you for your work. I love your podcast. It is amazing. You dive into topics that you're just bucking the trend, and I love it. Why don't you tell people where they can find that as well?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. The podcast is called the Energy Balance Podcast, and you can find it on all podcast platforms and on YouTube as well if you'd like to watch the videos. And as you were saying, we're talking about freedom from restriction and all these restrictive diets, as well as the kind of fake sweeteners and everything. So yeah, it's time to be free from that. Time to free ourselves from that. So
just eat real food. What a concept, right?
yeah,
So
seriously.
thank you, Jay. And thank you, everyone else, for joining us today. If I can help you with your health issues, you can contact me directly through the website, sarabantahealth.com. Happy to put together a protocol for you, answer any of your questions from this podcast. And you can join the free group coaching on Telegram with the link below. I teach you on a daily basis, answer your questions, and you will see articles and videos and just taking back control with education. You can follow me on Facebook and Instagram under Accelerated Health Products and across over 100 channels under Accelerated Health TV and Radio Show. My goal, as I mentioned, is to reach everyone on earth with eyes to see and ears to hear my message of healing. So help me with that goal. Share this podcast with a few of your friends who may need my help. And join us every week, Mondays at 2 p.m. Pacific, Tuesdays at 1 p.m. Pacific, and a bonus on Thursdays. And you can see all of this on my website, sarabantahealth.com. Use coupon WELCOME10 for 10% off site-wide. Thanks again for joining us here, and have a great week.